I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dona and Susan and then get out of the way so you can get into your conversation. Dona Lee became an Arlington Alexandria Extension Master Gardener in 2016. She's enjoyed gardening at the City of Alexandria's Chinkapin Community Garden for the past 10 years. She shares her vegetable gardening experience via Master Gardener training classes and the plant clinic at the Old Town Alexandria Farmers Market. In 2020, she started an effort at Chinkapin to grow vegetables and herbs for a local Alexandria food bank. Thanks for presenting today, Dona. Susan Wilhelm is a third generation gardener who grows vegetables, herbs, and flowers in her Alexandria garden. She and her husband often joke that they bought their house because it had enough sun to grow tomatoes. Susan has been an Extension Master Gardener since 2016, similar to Dona. She teaches public education classes on vegetable and herb gardening and also serves on the MGNV social media committee and writes gardening book reviews for the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website. Thanks for being here, Susan, and sharing your knowledge. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to both of you and we will get going.
All righty. Thank you so much, Ben. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to focus on highlighting 10 vegetables that you should consider growing here in Northern Virginia. Everyone should have received a link to a handout that has additional resources which supplement what we'll talk about today. It came with the meeting reminder. Everyone also will receive an email following this, as Ben said, and it'll have a PDF of all the slides that we're presenting to you here in a 4-slide per page format, which should be pretty good to be able to see all the detail. So a really nice thing about living here in Northern Virginia is that we're in USDA hardiness zones 7A, 7B, and 8A. So that means we have a really long growing season. It's about 7 months between our last frost in April and our first frost in the fall. This winter was a little bit unusual. We had more snow and colder temperatures than we expected. And that was followed by a spring with unexpectedly high temperatures, summer-like temperatures, followed by cool weather again. So it's been a little bit tricky to figure out what to do in our gardens. We even had a near frost this past week, 11 days after the estimated last frost date. So you have to be on your toes as a gardener. Based on the last few years, we're expecting more summer days with higher humidity and temperatures over 90 degrees, along with somewhat inconsistent rainfall. So we'll talk about how to address some of these challenges as we discuss our top 10 vegetables. Let's look at the planting picture. Here's a chart that was created by the Virginia Cooperative Extension and the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, and it has a wealth of information. Although it's for Zone B, hardiness Zone B, we've given you a reference in the resource handout that is the Virginia Home Garden Vegetable Planting Guide with recommended planting dates. You can use that to modify the dates and the planting windows that we provide here to adjust for your zone if you're in other parts of Northern Virginia or if you're in other parts of the state or elsewhere. So I want to use this chart to illustrate the options for planting in our area. Across the top are the months from March to October, and they're broken up into 10-day segments. On the left-hand side are optimum soil temperatures for planting any of the vegetables to the right. So we have a list there in that first major column of 30 vegetables that you can grow in Northern Virginia. Across the lines, purple indicates planting times. Yellow indicates times where you can continue to plant, but you might be able to harvest based on the maturity of the variety you planted. And then green indicates the harvest window. And so you'll see we start in March and we go all the way to October. There's also an asterisk next to some of the names of the plants in that left-hand column. Asterisk indicates that that is a plant that is typically grown from a transplanter and planted as a transplant as opposed to direct sown. And that's things like tomatoes and peppers. They have a longer maturity time. And based on our temperatures, you want to give them a head start by planting them as transplants. Maturity date, just so you know, on seed packets are measured from when either the seeds germinate or when the transplants get planted out. So if something says 60 to 70 days, that means after you put it in the ground as a plant, when you'll see your first fruit, or you put the seeds in the ground and once they germinate, it's 60 to 70 days, typically from that. So to take advantage of our growing time, let's see, we can start in spring. So we have all these vegetables here that go from collards to cauliflower. Then we also can plant those same vegetables, collards to cauliflower, in the time from late July, August, September, into October, and possibly overwinter them. So that's what we're calling the spring, fall vegetables that we're going to talk about as part of our top 10. Then we switch and we go to that April to October timeframe. And that's when we're going to plant what we typically consider the summer vegetables, and they range from beans to watermelon. There's a link at the bottom to that chart on the MGMB website. It's a handy dandy chart to have available to you as you're working in the garden sometimes and you have some seeds and you're deciding if it's time to plant them. So here is the selection criteria that we considered in selecting our top 10 vegetables. All the vegetables check the boxes on one or more of these criteria. Some vegetables that we're talking about that are really fun to grow with kids, either because it's a nice way for them to get involved, they get to experience planting and germination. Things like bean seeds, when they germinate, are just really beautiful to watch and easy for kids to plant because they're a nice sized seed. And also, a lot of the vegetables on the list that you'll see are vegetables that kids love to pick and eat. So let's get to it. So here's the top 10 vegetables that we're going to highlight today. The first four, lettuce, spinach, the root vegetables, and kale and collards, are all those spring fall vegetables that I was talking about. And then the last six are our favorite summer vegetables, from beans down to squash. At the end, we're going to throw in a little bit of information on garlic and herbs for you to take away, and we've given you some references for that as well. So before we get started into the specific vegetables, we want to talk about some keys for growing spring and fall vegetables, sort of across that family. Our days are either shorter and gradually getting longer, like in the spring. Like yesterday, we had over 13 hours of sun between sunrise and sunset. Or in the fall, the days are getting shorter. So this is perfect for many of the spring fall vegetables because they can take partial sun being 4 to 5 hours. So that, some people, that's like maybe all that they have. Or they can take a little bit more sun, can get 5 or 6 hours. Or for some of the root vegetables, actually, they can take even more. So that's kind of helpful. All the vegetables on the list, they like loose, well-drained soil. They all want to be well weeded. They don't like to compete with the weeds. And in some cases, weeds will bring in some of the insects that are a bother. Susan's going to talk about thinning the root vegetables when she gets to her part. All the vegetables really like to be mulched, especially in this area, because again, we have those highs and lows in temperature and we have the drought, the too much water. So what you want to do is, after the plants are settled, you want to put 2 to 3 inches of mulch around the plants to help keep down the weeds, protect from those temperature changes, and also help keep in moisture. So one of the things you're doing is you're helping keep the soil from getting too hot at the surface. So that's kind of helpful. And you're also protecting the plants from having the soil splash back up on the plants and possibly sending fungal spores, bacterial spores onto the plant and causing them to get some diseases. Now you can use straw, you can use untreated grass clippings, you can use leaf mulch, which some cities provide for free. Any of that works really well as mulch. Typically, we've already talked, you want to plant early March to April, and then again in the summer. Watering is important. And one of the things, because of our weather, we want to mention right up front is 3 inexpensive tools that we think would help inform your planting and your planning and your watering. And that is a soil thermometer, a rain gauge, and a moisture meter. And that way you'll know, have you had rain? You can use the moisture meter to check. Sometimes one part of a garden bed will be different than another, so you might want to check in more than one place. And what you typically want to do is water when the gauge is showing in the red. If it's in the green or the blue, that typically means you've gotten enough water. Plants like an inch of water weekly. In our area, in a year, we'll get on average 40 inches of rain, although in some years lately it's been 60, but it's never an inch weekly. And so some weeks you get too much and you need to let things dry out. Other weeks you need to consider watering. Last thing you want to do is not spray the foliage, and you want to water deeply because you want to encourage deep roots. You don't want to come in every day or every other day and sort of spray your plants or just water them really quickly. You're better off spending a little more time in the garden, but less often, which makes less work for you coming to the garden all the time. And then lastly, we'll talk later about it, but your spring greens will often flower and go to seed. We call that bolting. And that will actually bring in pollinators early to the garden, which is really helpful with the summer crop. So now I'm going to turn it over to Susan, who's going to start out with our vegetables.
For each of the vegetables that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to provide you with some general information on growing tips, including planting and harvesting. We're going to talk about the different types of the vegetable that's available and some good bets for types you might want to try in Northern Virginia. Our good bets list is not an exclusive list. Generally, they're varieties that either Dona and I have grown or we know other master gardeners who have. But be aware there are lots and lots of other choices. Each of the vegetables we're talking about today are also suitable for growing in containers. So if you're a container gardener, please check out our container gardening class done by our own Ben Murphy that's on the Master Gardener website. So let's start with lettuce. Lettuce is one of the easiest cool season vegetables to grow, and it can even withstand a light frost. You start planting lettuce in the spring as soon as the soil can be worked when the temperatures are at least 40 degrees, and you can continue planting through the end of April. In fall lettuce, you start planting that in early September and can plant through mid-October. Lettuce seeds need light to germinate, so be sure that you don't plant them too deeply. And later in the spring, consider planting types of lettuce that are heat tolerant, such as oak leaf. And the reason you want to do that is that as the days get longer and the temperatures get warmer, lettuce can bolt and go to seed. The seed package will tell you generally whether or not the lettuce is heat tolerant, but as a rule, leaf lettuce is generally more heat tolerant than some of the other types we're going to be talking about. Leaf lettuce is actually the type most gardeners grow in Northern Virginia, either the red or green, and that's because you just have to plant it and harvest it. As a group, it's the most forgiving of poor soil, and as I just mentioned, is generally more heat tolerant, and there's lots and lots of different kinds. Romaine, also called Cos, and Butterhead are two other choices. They have a thicker, crunchier leaf than the leaf lettuce, and the Butterhead gets its name because some people think that the leaves have a creamy texture that reminds them of butter. In terms of nutrition, romaine is the most nutritious, and it's followed by leaf lettuce. Good bets for Butterhead include Dynamite and Butter Crunch. Romaine, red romaine is a good choice, as well as Little Gem, which is a miniature green romaine, which is also very heat tolerant. For leaf lettuce, you might try black-seeded Simpson, which is a green leaf lettuce, Red Sails, or Shireen Sky, which are both red. If you're like me and you like them all, you might want to try a lettuce mix. I use a mix that is a combination of red and green lettuces and baby romaines, and I've had really good luck with that over the seasons. There's two main ways to harvest leaf lettuce that I want to call to your attention in particular. You can either take the whole plant or head, or you can harvest from the outside moving in. If you harvest the leaves from the outside, the ones that stay in the middle of the leaf lettuce plant will continue to grow and expand your harvest. For both romaine and butterhead, follow the seed package instructions for this particular type that you're growing. Next, I'm going to show you some pictures of some different types of leaf lettuce growing in my garden or Dona's garden. The lettuce on the top left is butterhead lettuce, and it's called Drunken Woman. That's in my garden. It's a beautiful green and red speckled lettuce, and as you can see, it's a loose leaf lettuce, but it forms a lovely head. On the bottom left, we have Shireen Sky from Dona's garden, and then on the right is a baby romaine. From here, we're going to move on to spinach. Spinach is another great early season crop. It's often called a superfood because it is so nutritious and has so many minerals and vitamins in it. You plant spinach a little later than lettuce when the temperatures are at least 45 degrees. And while lettuce can withstand light frost, spinach can actually withstand temperatures as low as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Like lettuce, it will also flower and go to seed if the temperatures get too warm. In Northern Virginia, spinach is a great candidate for planting in the fall and overwintering it. You can plant it anywhere from starting around September 20th through the end of October. And you've got two choices when it comes to the fall planting, both of which need the protection of row covers. And we'll talk about row covers more later in the presentation. But with a row cover, if you just want to grow your spinach through the fall, you can sometimes harvest as late as December. If you want to have a lovely harvest next spring, you can actually overwinter your spinach with a row cover and you'll be able to harvest it early in the spring. There are two types of spinach that are most commonly grown in Northern Virginia. The smooth leaf, which is harvested as a baby leaf, and it's one most commonly used in salads, and a Savoy leaf, which has a larger leaf that's a little bit crinkled. Two good examples of these are for the savoy leaf, Bloomsdale and kohlrabi. For the smooth leaf, you might want to try space. Less frequently grown in our area, but still an option, is arrowleaf spinach, which is used commonly in Japanese cooking. It has a triangular shaped leaf, just like its name suggests. If you're interested in trying it, Flamingo Improved is a variety that is more resistant to powdery mildew. In terms of harvesting spinach, it's the same as lettuce. You can either harvest whole heads or work from the outside in, leaving the center of the plant to grow and continue your harvest. Next, we're going to move on to the root vegetables, and we're going to talk about radishes, carrots, and beets. There's a couple of things that root vegetables share in common that I want to address up front. The first of these is that, as Dona's already mentioned, they have to be thinned. The plants will germinate and come up too close together, and you need to remove some of them in order to allow room for the roots to grow. And how much you leave between them will depend on what it is that you're growing. Radishes, because they have a small root, can be closer together, where spring radishes and where winter radishes, which get quite large, need to be further apart. Second, your radish roots, your beet roots, and your carrots sometimes poke up above the ground. And when that happens, you want to lightly cover them with some more soil, because if you don't, the sun can damage the tops of your vegetables. Now, getting into radishes specifically, home gardeners generally plant two different types of radishes. There's the spring radish, which is the one you commonly see in the grocery store. It's round and red, generally about an inch in diameter. The pictures in the top left-hand corner are both of spring radishes. They come in lots of different colors, and they're a great radish to plant with kids because they come up so quickly. They can be ready to harvest in as early as 25 days, which is about as close to instant gratification in a garden as you could get. Spring radishes can be planted every 10 to 14 days from the time the soil can be worked in early spring. And even though they're called spring radishes, they can be planted again in the fall for a harvest then. Like lettuce, spring and fall radishes can withstand frost. The other option is what are called winter radishes. They're usually sown in the midsummer for a fall or winter harvest, and they take a lot longer to mature, between 45 and 75 days. And as I mentioned, because they're so much bigger, you're going to be thinning for larger space between them so they can do their roots. For spring radishes, some varieties that you might want to try include Cherry Belle and Champion. In the top left-hand photo, those are Cherry Bells on the top and Champions on the bottom. Those are from Dona's garden. French Breakfast is another option. It has a cylindrical shaped radish. It's about 3 inches long, and it's a great one for planting a little later in the spring because it's more heat tolerant. In the fall, you're looking at daikon and watermelon radishes. Daikon radishes look like big white carrots. Some people think they have a little sharper taste than a spring radish. They can get huge, 1 to 2 pounds and up to 18 inches long, but you're going to want to harvest them when they're about 8 inches long. Watermelon radishes look just like what their name implies. They're a light green on the outside, and when you cut into them, they're a beautiful pink color. You can use them raw in salads, you can pickle them, and they're also great roasted or sautéed. You harvest your radishes according to your directions on your seed package. One thing to keep in mind, though, spring radishes need to be harvested as soon as they are ready. They will not benefit from a prolonged time in the ground after that. On the other hand, once winter radishes reach their full maturity, they can stay in the ground for a little while, and it will not affect the taste or the quality of the vegetable. And I saw in the chat that someone asked about radishes, whether the greens were edible, and they are. The entire plant is edible. Moving on to carrots, the most important thing that you need to know when it comes to growing carrots is that you have to have a well-drained, deep, loose, fertile soil. That means wherever you're going to plant your carrots, you got to dig down into the dirt, remove any rocks or clumps of dirt that you find, because otherwise you're going to have misshapen carrots coming out of the ground. You plant them when the soil temperature is at least 45 degrees, about the same time that you do your spinach in the spring. And in the fall, you plant them 10 to 12 weeks before the last frost. Carrots, depending on weather conditions and the kind you're growing, can take from 1 to 3 weeks to germinate. And the seedlings are pretty weak. So you need to make sure that the soil surface where your planting bed area stays moist until the seedlings emerge. If the soil gets a crust on it, the seedlings will not be able to emerge. And there's two different ways that you can do that. One thing is just to be regularly in your garden and keep it damp and moist with watering. Another option is to lay a piece of burlap over the planting area. It'll help keep the soil moist and the seedlings will grow up through the open parts of the burlap. You just need to be careful when you remove the burlap in order not to damage the seedlings underneath. You might also consider planting radishes and carrots together. The radishes will come up first, break up the ground, and the carrots will come on later. There are 5 main types of carrots to grow, and several of them do very well in our area. In general, because we have high clay soils, the short and the rounder types do better. Unless your soil is really deeply worked, avoid carrots where the seed package says it'll be 8 inches or longer. So I'm going to talk about the types and the good bets together. Among the good bets are Atlas, which is a round radish. It gets about 2.5 inches in diameter. And it's a good choice because some round radishes will split. Atlas is less likely to do so. Another carrot, Nance, is a cylindrical type carrot. Mokum and Little Fingers are 2 examples of that. Mokum you can harvest at 3 inches as a baby carrot. Little Fingers you can harvest either at 3 inches as a baby carrot or let it go to 6 inches. Chantenay is a triangular shaped carrot, and that's a picture of Chantenay carrots on the lower left-hand side of this slide. It grows about 4 inches long, really good in clay soils. Imperator carrots are the kind you're most likely to see in the grocery store. They grow really long, and there's a general rule, don't do as well in our soil. But if you like that taste, the Danvers half long is a good choice because it has the same coloring as the Imperator, but it's a shorter carrot that grows better in our soil. You can harvest your carrots anytime after they're about 1/2 inch in diameter. One thing you don't want to do, though, is try to pull them out by the greens on the top. The greens will break, so you'll want to loosen the soil around the carrots so you can gently dig it out. If your carrots are getting to harvest stage at different rates, you can dig out the big carrots, leaving the smaller ones, and they'll continue to grow. If you're growing carrots in the fall, if you mulch them before the ground freezes, you can actually harvest them throughout the winter. And some people think that the winter harvested carrots are actually the best flavors. Now we're going to talk about beets. And beets are grown both for their sweet and colorful roots as well as their nutritious leaves. You can plant beets starting at the end of April for a spring harvest and mid-August to mid-September for a fall harvest. A couple of things to keep in mind. Beet seeds benefit from being soaked in water overnight before planting. They'll germinate a little faster. And each of the little seeds that you get in the package are actually multiple seeds that are in a little capsule. So what will happen is when you plant them, you'll get a whole bunch of little sprouts in one clump that you'll need to thin down to one. The thinnings from all the vegetables I've talked about so far, the root vegetables, can be used in the same way as microgreens on your salad, so you don't have to throw them away. And then you harvest beets based on their size, depending on what you're growing. There are basically 3 types. There's a dark red, there are striped, and there are yellow. For dark red, a good choice is Detroit red. It's an heirloom that's been planted since the late 1800s. Early Wonder and Chioggia Guardsman are both striped. Early Wonder is a red and white stripe. Chioggia Guardsman is a pink and white stripe. The striped beets will not stay striped when you cook them. Boulder is an example of a yellow beet. It's very bright yellow and it will keep its color when it is cooked. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dona to talk about collards and kale.
Thanks, Susan. So kale and collards are part of the brassica family, as was radish. And kale and collards are the leafy members of that family. The others are Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli. So kale works wonderfully in the spring and the summer. Both kale and collards are very cold hardy, but then they can also handle temperatures down to 10 degrees, but yet they're heat resistant. So that makes them a very versatile plant. So kale and collards can be planted in the fall and they'll overwinter and survive the cold. They survive the days down to even 6 degrees with some row cover. And then they'll pick up again in the spring. And then as the weather gets hotter, those will flower and you could plant more kale and collards like around this time to carry you into actually the early summer. They're easy to sow, but you can jumpstart the season by planting transplants. If you place them 8 to 12 inches apart, you'll get larger leaves like the size of your hands, and you can harvest the outer leaves, or you can plant them closer if you prefer tender baby size. As the spring turns to summer, sometimes kale and collards can be visited by harlequin bugs, and sometimes they'll be visited by whiteflies. Both are easily managed, and we'll talk about that a little bit near the end. Now, there are 4 types of kale. There's curly kale, which is what you see in bunches in the grocery store. You'll see flat Russian Siberian. That tends to have a little bit flatter around the stem and then a little more curly around the edges. And then you have the Italian kale, which is also called Tuscan or lacinato or dinosaur. And then lastly, you can have Chinese kale, which is also called Chinese broccoli. In terms of collards, you have a heading variety, you have a cabbage variety where it comes into like a loose cabbage kind of shape. You have a glaze where the leaf is actually shiny. You also have a perennial type, which is called tree, which will grow apparently to 8 foot tall, which is kind of crazy, 6 to 8 foot tall. Or you have bunching, which is more of a loose head like that you can harvest. Some of them have curly leaves. The picture there in the lower left is a flat leaf variety. Some will have different colors. You can have the green, you can have purplish green, and you can even have a little bit yellowish green color. So if you want to try different colors in the colors, you can do that. In the kale, some of those Russian varieties tend to have different colored stems and the leaves a little bit as well. So in terms of the best bets for kale, the dwarf blue curled Beets, again, that's the one you see in the grocery store a lot. Cyberphils is a really nice curly edged Russian style. The dazzling blue, the red Russian, the white Russian, and the red Ursa, those all tend to have veins that are either whitish, reddish, or actually the blue, and the dazzling blue, I've grown that, it's really nice. The darker boars, the ruby boars, and the red boars, they tend to even have a little bit of a darker kind of reddish leaf as well. The ebony and the Nero Toscana are Italian varieties. And I forgot to mention this, but the Italian kale tends to be a little bit taller, a little bit more tender, a little bit of a darker leaf. And so it sort of grows tall with maybe the leaf being maybe like 4 inches across total, something like that. The Scarlett is a variety that we're trying in the Master Gardener's demonstration garden. And that one's a really frilly leaf Chinese broccoli, Chinese kale. And it's even suggested that that's a good substitute for radicchio. So that sounds kind of interesting. I look forward to seeing that in the demonstration garden. In terms of collards, we have Champion and Georgia Southern is an heirloom variety that's been around a long time. Champion is a hybrid that's been grown for better resistance to some of the diseases and also for better heat resistance to take it into the summer. Now here we have kale that overwintered with garlic that was planted in the fall as well. And both of those are looking really healthy. The kale tends to slow down in the winter months in like January, February, and then it starts to pick up in March as the temperatures warm. Kale planted over winter like that, like my kale there on the right, that was kale that overwintered, and that's white Russian. And that one just started flowering this month. And you can see little green buds. Those are delicious. You can take them off initially to try to slow down the plant actually going to seed and try to get it to grow some more good sized leaves. It'll just give up on you though, and it'll just start growing lots of buds, which is what it did there. And I like to let them stay. They'll turn yellow and they're a really simple flower that are good for a lot of the pollinators. What happens is they bolt in plants like lettuce and in kales, they start to form smaller leaves underneath the buds. And then the leaves start to get more bitter. They're still edible. You can use them in more cooked dishes than maybe a salad, but they're fine. But at some point, kale will be done. You'll have to plant fresh.
Next, we're going to talk about vegetables that grow in the summertime. And summertime vegetables share a lot of things in common with spring and fall vegetables. Things like needing to be planted in good loose soil, keeping them well weeded, mulching, the 1 inch of water a week, especially when the plants are flowering and fruiting, and interplanting them with flowers to attract beneficial insects and pollinators. Where summer vegetables differ from the spring and fall vegetables is that they need more sun, 6 to 8 hours plus a day, and they also need warmer temperatures. The soil temperature should be at least 60 degrees, and for some plants, the optimal soil temperature range is actually between 75 and 90 degrees. And we're going to start talking about the summer vegetables by focusing on beans, with bush beans coming up first. Bush beans are really popular because of both that they mature quickly and because of their small size. You plant them once the soil temperatures have reached 60 degrees, and then you can plant them for every 2 to 3 weeks until the middle of April. This is an area where having a soil thermometer really helps because your soil may reach 60 degrees much earlier than you think it will. The bushes are self-supporting. They mature quicker than pole beans, and they also fix nitrogen in the soil. One thing that you want to keep in mind is that when you're working among your beans, you want to keep the beans off the ground to the extent you can, and don't touch the plants like after a heavy dew in the morning until they've dried out, which can help prevent the transmission of diseases. Mexican bean beetles can be an issue for beans planted in July or the end of June, growing into July, and we'll talk about some quick fixes for that later on in the presentation. There are several different types of beans. Snap beans, or the green beans like you see in the picture on the left, are the ones that we recommend the most. They're quick to mature and they're high productivity. And one other thing I want to share with you about summer vegetables is the more that you pick, the more that you get. So you really want to be on top of harvesting. Your other choices, though, include green shelling beans, which are grown for the bean inside the pod, and drying beans, which are grown for the seed inside the pod and are actually harvested when the whole pod is dry. There are also choices. They're good choices if that's what you're into, and you should definitely plant them. But if you're looking for something that's going to be giving you a quick return, the snap beans are the best choice of these three. In terms of there's good bets, as you can see, there's lots, and this doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. Maxabelle is a French fillet bean. It's very small and slender. Jade is another slim, round green bean. Blue Lake 274 was the highest performing bean in a trial done by Virginia master gardeners across the state last year. They grew that against Provider, which is another very good green bean, and the Blue Lake 274 came out on top. Dragon's tongue is a really cool green bean. It's flat yellow and it has little purple markings on it. And pencil pod is an example of a golden round wax bean. One thing to keep in mind when you're harvesting beans is that you want to clip the beans off with scissors or some kind of clipper. If you try to pull the bean off the plant, you're likely to get half the plant coming with it, often with other immature beans or flowers on it that could affect your total harvest. Now, you might think, if bush beans are so good, why would anybody want to plant a pole bean? But pole beans have a lot going for them as well. For one thing, they take up less space. You're growing vertically into the air, so it's a good choice for people with small garden spaces. They also produce over a longer period of time, so you get more harvest per foot in terms of your planting space. Another really good benefit is that you don't have to bend over to pick the beans. Some people think pole beans taste better than snap beans, but taste is pretty much a personal decision, and I'm not sure I would want to pick. You're going to plant your pole beans at about the same time as your bush beans, but pole beans need to be supported. You either need to have a trellis or a pole. Some people will make little tripods out of tall bamboo poles where you create a triangle and you plant the bean seeds in a circle around the base of each leg of the tripod. In the bottom picture here on the left, those are Dona's long beans growing on a cage that she made by making a circle out of some fencing wire. The other good thing about beans is they produce all summer long. You can get pole beans that are green, you can get pole beans that are yellow, And you can also grow the long beans. And the long beans, or the Chinese green beans, are a great choice because the Mexican bean beetles won't bother them. I've grown the Monte Gusto yellow pole bean for years and have had really good success every year. Neither Dona and I have grown a green pole bean, but Blue Lake and Kentucky Wonder are both types of pole beans that have been around for a really, really long time and may be a good place to start if you're interested in trying that. The next summer vegetable we're going to talk about is okra. And okra is a beautiful, beautiful plant. It's so pretty that I know one master gardener that has grown it in their front yard like a foundation planting. It has yellow flowers that look like hibiscus, and that's because it is a relative of the hibiscus family. You want to plant it in the full sun in well-drained soil. Once it's established, it can handle a little bit of drought, but you may need to water it if you have an extended drought period. Just be careful not to give it too much water because that could contribute to root rot. There are two types, a dwarf and a tall. The dwarf gets about 3 feet tall. The tall one can get 8, even 10 feet tall, and you actually may need to stake the tall one to keep it from falling over. They come in different colors. There can be a white or red or a green pod. And your choices to start are Clemson spineless. It's a green one. It's particularly liked because some okras have spikes on them and they can be a little prickly to harvest, but the Clemson spineless does not. It's the classic okra that you use in fried okra or gumbo, and you harvest those pods when they're about 3 inches long. Bowling red and Okinawa pink and other varieties have gorgeous red stems as well as red okra. You can harvest those when they're a little longer. They're still good from 3 to 6 inches in length. And no matter how careful you harvest and look under the leaves, you're always going to miss one. And you'll see one, you'll say, oh, this needs to grow another day. It'll be just perfect. You get sidetracked, you come back, and it's 7 inches long. You have to take those larger pods off. They're tough and woody. You can't eat them. And if you leave them on the plant, it's a signal to the plant to stop producing. In the next slide, we're going to show you some pictures of some red okras. I don't know which one this is, but you'll notice the pretty red stems. And on the picture on the left, if you look at the top, you can see the little red okras starting to form. Unfortunately, the red okras do turn green when you cook them, but they're still wonderful to eat. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dona.
Thanks, Susan. That was great. Some people I know take those 7-inch ones and let them dry and they make really nice wreaths out of them. I just suggest that. So I'm going to talk about 2 vegetables to start that are in the same family, tomatoes and peppers. These are 2 of my favorite vegetables to grow. I have a lot of growing tips. I'm going to try not to dwell too long on this slide, but if I do, it's all because I want you to have success with your tomatoes. First off, tomatoes grow roots along the stems, so you want to plant them deeply. So if they get kind of leggy or you get them from the store and they're kind of leggy, you want to take the leaves off along the stem and plant them down to that next set of leaves. You may sometimes have to take a couple sets of leaves off. Don't worry, it'll be fine. And it's actually better for the plant than having this spindly stem above the soil. All tomatoes, no matter the variety, need some kind of support. And we'll talk about determinate and indeterminate next. But you want to have tall stakes or tall cages, or you can do some kind of thing with poles and string between that go around the tomatoes, and you keep adding more string. That's called a Florida weave. But you'll need to do something. Those cages that they sell at the store that are 42 or 48 inches tall, those aren't tomato cages. Those are pepper cages, in my opinion. So there on the top left, that's a 2-part tomato cage. I guess it probably ends up measuring at least 5 or 6 feet. It goes in the ground, has some supports there. I often add long poles to that as well, because the tomatoes, that's July, the tomatoes will end up over the top of the cage, and probably if the cages are close to each other, spilling from one onto the other and kind of creating like this tomato hedge. You can see near the bottom that some of the lower leaves have been trimmed. That was my mom's garden, and I hadn't visited in a while, so I think the first thing I did after taking that picture was trim some of those lower leaves. But you want to keep the bottom 8 to 12 inches of the stem free of leaves. You don't want them touching the ground. You want to mulch around the plants, just like we've talked. Pretty much everything you should be mulching around it. It does all the same things. It helps with the soil. It helps with the disease. You also want to, if the tomatoes get too bushy, you want to maybe thin some of the stems out or take some of the branches off that aren't providing tomatoes, because you want to have some airflow. The important things to avoid splitting and animal damage on tomatoes is you want to pick any tomatoes as they, what we call it, breaking color from green to what they call a hard green to or mature green to like a breaker. And then definitely by the time they're turning, and turning means that part of it has like kind of a yellowish color coming from green. It doesn't mean that the whole tomato has to be fully that color. Frankly, once it gets a little bit of that lighter color, it is ready to take off the plant. And what I do is I put them inside on like a cookie tray with a paper towel on it so that if any of them have any damage to them or they're starting to split a little bit, I'll know and they won't infect or cause any of the other tomatoes actually to spoil. Don't need to be in the sun. Matter of fact, shouldn't be in the sun, shouldn't be in the fridge. Just, cool place if you have it. But they sort of like 70 degrees. So inside the house is sort of perfect. If it's going to rain and you have tomatoes that are starting to ripen, you definitely want to pick them at that point. Like cherry tomatoes, if they're ready or near ready and you haven't picked them and you get a rain, you're going to come back to a plant covered with split cherry tomatoes. The problem with that is they're not going to keep. You're going to have to just eat them as you take them off or throw them away and put them in your compost pile. Interesting to know about tomatoes are as it gets hotter and the temperatures get above 90 degrees and above 80 degrees at night, that is really not optimum for tomatoes. So what happens is temperatures above 86 degrees, they suppress ethylene production. So, when people talk about bananas and apples, they put off ethylene as they ripen. Well, apparently there's an internal mechanism in tomatoes that causes ethylene to be produced, which tells a tomato to start ripening. And then that causes the lycopene to develop, which is the red color. So it's the lycopene and the carotene. And that is what is the health benefit of tomatoes is that lycopene and the carotene is very, very healthy. And it turns out that homegrown tomatoes have a lot more of that in them than store-bought tomatoes. So there you go. So what happens is they'll slow down. You may have green tomatoes on the plant. No worries, just be patient. What will happen is as the temperature drops, those tomatoes will start to ripen and they'll be fine. If you end up taking green tomatoes inside, sometimes they'll change color a little bit if they're real green, but they really never get that same flavor and they don't soften because you haven't had those chemical interactions that need to have. Once they hit that breaker or that turning stage, then the ethylene process has gotten set off and the lycopene process has started, is being synthesized, and it will continue to happen. And the tomatoes will be delicious. I've had trays and trays of tomatoes in my living room and on my kitchen counter waiting to ripen because I usually have like 15 plants going. So that's that picture on the bottom, which Ben Murphy was kind enough to create for me. It's based on some work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was advice to growers on the stages of tomato ripening. But you all know that because you grow tomatoes. Here's the types. You have determinate versus indeterminate. So determinate tomatoes are short and they'll grow to 4 to 5 feet. Those are the ones that you can maybe use the tall cage, maybe. They tend to set their fruit mostly at the same time, which is good for growers because sometimes they want to have all that fruit come in as opposed to over a longer season for their purposes. They're really good because it's also good in a container and that way you don't need this giant cage. You can put something in a little bit shorter. So people with containers like determinate tomatoes. Non-determinate are viney and they'll grow and they'll grow and they'll grow. And like that picture I showed you before, they might get to 8 feet tall or more. Especially cherry tomatoes, small tomatoes tend to just grow like crazy. Now, heirloom tomatoes, you can save the seeds from them and the next year that plant will have the same tomato as the parent that the seed came from. Hybrid tomatoes are tomatoes that are bred for various things. They're bred to be hardier so that they can be shipped. They're bred to have a different color. They're bred to be disease resistant because some diseases that they'll get. If you save seeds from a hybrid plant, they will not grow true to the parent. They will grow to possibly 1 or 2 or whatever the parents were that was used to develop the hybrid. Some people say heirloom seeds taste better than hybrid. I grow both and I've found varieties of both that are delicious. Frankly, just homegrown tomatoes are delicious. Size ranges from there are cherry tomatoes that are less than an ounce. There are some cherry tomatoes that are a little bit more than that. There are beefsteaks that are a pound or more. And then there's the ones in between. Colors are all colors of the rainbow, plus there are bicolors, plus there are striped. There actually are green tomatoes that are intended to be picked as green. I've grown those. It's a little tricky to figure out when they're ripe. You have to a little bit go on the field when they start to get a little bit soft. And then tomatoes are good for everything, salad, slicing, sauces, cooking, you name it. We have a lot of good bets here. Like Susan has said before, there are tons, probably hundreds of tomato varieties that you could try. These are ones that we've tried, and these are ones that have been tried in our demonstration garden in Arlington. So of those smalls, I've grown them all. I love to grow smalls. I pick them early, like I said, if rain is coming or if they're starting to ripen, and I let them ripen inside in a bowl, kind of in one single layer so that they're not on top of each other. They're great for cooking and they're great for eating. I mean, I can make sauce out of small tomatoes. It's first to harvest the early girl, the 4th of July, and the early treat. They're ready in about 60 days, and they're about 4 to 6 ounce tomatoes, a nice sized tomato. And they're a beautiful red color, and they tend to be kind of uniform looking, almost like those little tomatoes that you used to get in those little plastic crates, like 3 tomatoes to a crate. Determinant two varieties that work well. I've grown Jolene, and I like that one. That one and Celebrity Plus were both in the Virginia vegetable trials last year and did well. Susan loves the Arkansas Traveler and the Mountain Magic. The demonstration garden is growing the purple zebra, which is a striped tomato with a darker meat. And then all those large ones there, some of those are hybrids, some are heirlooms, and they're all delicious and they're all great for, like that sort of slicer making a sandwich, it's serving on a platter with a little bit of seasoning. And then sauce San Marzano is a typical one that's quite nice. So in that picture there, you see a large tomato with green stripes. It's beautiful. You see some what are probably the early varieties there next to it. So you can kind of see the difference in size. And the beans, those were all grown at our demonstration garden. So let's go on to peppers. Some similar things here. What I didn't say about tomatoes, and I meant to, is both tomatoes and peppers originate from South America. So what that tells you is they do like the heat. And in fact, both tomatoes and peppers in the right environment can be considered perennials. But they're a tender perennial, so that means that they're really sensitive to cold and frost and stuff. And so they really don't like temperatures much below 55. But if you actually lived in the right climate, you could actually grow a tomato or a pepper for multiple years, but we treat them here as annuals and plant anew every year. Pepper plants are bushy, they can be really heavy yielding, and because of that, they need some kind of a cage or at the very least a stake. And you need to make sure that you secure the pepper plant to the stake. I've come into the garden in the food bank, and one of the pepper plants has just literally fallen over because the fastening had come loose and it was so filled with jalapenos, it just literally fell over. It didn't break. We had to prop it back up and make sure that we secured it. On that picture there, those are all hot peppers that I've grown in my garden. That was all 1 year. The little tiny red ones, that is the original peppers that came out of South America, and they were a little hot pepper. Today we call them bird peppers because the thought is that the birds ate them and then they flew north and spread them to Central America, Mexico, and Texas, and the seeds come out and they get spread. They also got spread to Europe via Christopher Columbus back in the 1400s. The peppers originally were hot. And the first thing breeders did was, as they started to play with peppers, is they said, let's see if we can make a sweet one. So it's capsaicin that causes the heat in a pepper. And so what they did with the sweet ones is they managed to get to the point where they found peppers that weren't as hot, and they kept breeding those. And then they found some more that wasn't as hot. So they've now created quite a few varieties of peppers that are sweet. Bell peppers and jalapenos are two of the most popular peppers in the world. Now, the heat is measured in what's called Scoville units, and that was from a chemist named Wilbur Lincoln Scoville, who came up with this technique of taking pepper meat and mixing it with water and having test subjects taste it. And if it was still hot, he added more water. And they finally got to the point where it wasn't hot to them, to their taste. That meant it had a high number because it took a lot of liquid to dilute the heat in the pepper. Nowadays, we have equipment that does that and measures the Scoville units. You want to, again, like tomatoes, prune away any leaves that touch the ground because you want to prevent the transfer of soil-borne diseases, and you want to definitely promote airflow. You want to fertilize with a low nitrogen fertilizer after the first fruit set. Once plants have developed their roots, which is the first thing you want them to do is roots and leaves to protect the plant from sun scald later, you don't want to give nitrogen anymore because you don't want the plant to be so full of leaves that it's working on making leaves and it's not making flowers and fruit. Peppers and tomatoes have what they call a perfect flower. So within that flower is both the male part and the female part. So it can get pollinated by insects, sometimes by airflow, bringing the seed from the male to the female. If you want to try to keep it going, sometimes people will shake their plants. People have indoor plants, they have to put like a fan or something on them to have some kind of pollination occur. Now, in terms of good bets and sweet, we have Lesja is a Ukrainian style that I've grown that's kind of a thick flesh and kind of comes to a point. It's beautiful. Corno de Toro is a longer sweet one. Banana Goddess is a beautiful sweet banana. There's also a hot banana. Flavor Burst is a little bit of a smaller bell pepper type shape. California Wonder is a classic. And then the last three are Italian varieties. They tend to be a little bit longer and like maybe an inch or two at the top, and then they come down to a point and they're great for frying and cooking. They have mild heat. I personally think shishitos have no heat, but people on occasion say they get one that's hot. But that's that little wrinkly one that's Japanese that people will saute and then some olive oil and add lemon and salt and just eat the whole thing except the stem. Poblanos are slightly hot and are good for stuffing. Venezuelan tiger we grew in the demonstration garden, and that was a mild heat pepper. Then we have the hots. All those are great. The one with the funny number is a Johnny's experimental pepper that they bred, never gave a name to, and it has really good production, and that's one of my favorites. Very hot habanero, those tend to have like 300,000 Scoville units, so that's really hot pepper. Super hot Carolina Reaper used to have the record as the Guinness Book for the hottest pepper, and it had 1.6 million Scoville units. And the same guy that developed that pepper came up with Pepper X, and it replaced the Carolina Reaper in 2023 with Scoville units of 2.4 million. The guy who made it said that after he ate it, it just wasn't a good thing. That's all. He's using it and selling things with food that use it. So here's a couple pepper pictures. The one on the left is a ají amarillo, which is a Peruvian pepper. Very nice. Hot heat, kind of getting towards the habanero. One in the center is a sweet Mad Hatter. It's got a really cute shape to it. We had a problem in our garden last year where we had tons of pods on the plant, and it took till October when things cooled down for them to ripen. And then they ripened almost all at once, but we had like dozens of pods on this plant that was just teeming and could hardly hold the weight of all the peppers. And the one on the right is a bell pepper starting green, and they're starting to turn red there. It's from the demonstration garden. So the next two and final plants that we're going to talk about are both from the cucurbit family. We're going to talk about cucumbers and squash. Both of them can be grown from seeds or transplants. One nice thing about transplants is sometimes you get ahead of some of the insects that can bother your plants. Sometimes things like slugs will eat your seed when it first germinates because it's so nice and tender. So sometimes it's better to grow a transplant and plant that out. You have two varieties. You can have long vines that need to be caged or trellised, or you can have bush varieties that do well in a container or just a smaller space. You don't want to have to trellis. Both are fine. The thing with cucumbers is they need consistent watering because the plant is mostly water. And so as they start to flower, you need to make sure that you water. You don't want the plant to be stressed. If the plant gets stressed, the cucumbers can start to get bitter. And if you let the cucumbers stay on there too long, if they start to turn yellow, those will be bitter, and it starts to tell the plant that maybe it's time to be done. Interesting thing about cucumbers is they've been bred over time such that the first one we had was monoecious type cucumbers that had both separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Bees or pollinators needed to take the pollen from the male flower and bring it to the female flower on that plant. And that was typical of cucumbers. Then over time, breeders have bred gynoecious varieties of cucumbers, and those are bred to have mostly only female flowers. There might occasionally be a male flower. So what they'll do is they will have to make sure that there's some plants with male flowers nearby so that they can pollinate the female flowers. And that's common because in that way they have lots of female flowers, which give them lots more candidates to have cucumbers on the plant. And then the parthenocarpic are a type of cucumber that's been bred to require no pollination, which means the seeds are really small in those cucumbers. And those are what they call burpless, and they're often thin-skinned. You can grow those and have them under a row cover if you're worried about insects. And you only actually have to take the row cover up if you want to harvest. Or if you want to grow any of these other types, you would need to take the row cover up once they start to flower so that they can get pollinated. So you can protect them at the beginning. So, their pepper types, there's slicing, pickling, there's the burpless. They also talk about snacking cucumbers. We have some varieties down there. There's a ton more varieties of cucumber. And one of the things you want to look for are varieties that are considered resistant to things like downy mildew and powdery mildew, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Both powdery mildew and downy mildew can impact both cucumbers and squash, and actually melons as well, which are part of the same family. And to help fight that, the typical things we talked about, right? Mulch, to keep stuff from splashing on the plant, pruning to give airflow, taking the diseased part that appears off the plant, cutting it off and throwing it in the trash, not in your compost pile. Those are things that you need to do. So the picture at the top was in my garden. It's a 10-foot trellis. I had cover over it originally, like a tool, which Susan has a picture of that later. By this point, it had gotten so big, I had to take the tool off and allow it to pollinate Turns out on that trellis, I had both Burpless, the Diva variety, and then I had Marketmore 76, and I had Watoma. So what ended up happening was it was kind of interesting because I could have left it covered if I had grown just Diva because I wanted 3 different varieties. I had to uncover it. So I didn't get the chance of protecting it for long, but it did pretty well. Here we have a cucumber plant growing on a trellis. It looks really great. And then you see to the right where it got struck by bacterial wilt, sometimes spread by insects. And when that happens, you can have a plant that looks as healthy as could be, like the one on the left, and then it starts wilting like that, and the whole plant's going to go, and you're going to have to remove it so it doesn't spread to other plants in the area. So lastly, we're going to talk about 2 types of squash. We have summer squash. This is the one that people leave on your doorstep because they've grown so much of it and they don't know what to do. And then we're going to talk about winter squash. So again, these are cucurbits, so same problem on same things. You can plant seeds or transplants. You want the soil temperatures to be 75 degrees. It's kind of nice for them. You want to protect them with row cover if you've had a problem with pests until the squash flowers, but then they'll need to be pollinated. Summer squash has a 60-day maturity period typically. So these can actually be succession planted. So you have a long season. If you're not having a problem with bugs, you could actually plant it multiple times once things warm up. We have 3 main types. You have the yellow straight neck and crook neck. You have the zucchini, and then you have patty pan. There's some other varieties this summer that have showed up. Like I've seen a golden egg zucchini, and I've seen a golden zucchini I like a lot. So there are some other like kind of different sort of shapes, but they're just takeoffs on those main ones. So on the bottom there, you see a summer squash variety that's growing. In the middle, you'll see zucchini. That's a good size to pick it. Both of those should be about, that's about the size you might want to pick them, nice and tender. And the top one is a patty pan. And I always think that one's fun to grow with kids because it's just such a cute shape. It's kind of like a flying saucer. Any of the summer squash, if they get bigger, sometimes they'll get it as long as your arm, from your fingertips to your elbow, and that'll be like a 4 or 5 pounder. It is edible. You just need to cut it down the middle and you'll need to take the seeds out. Or you can cut it across, take the seeds out, little rings, and make little pizzas out of it. It may take a little bit longer cooking because the outer skin is still edible, but it's just a little bit tougher than if it had been a 6 or an 8-inch squash. So there's some varieties that we've grown early prolific, and butter dish have been around a long time. Summer chiffon is one that we're trying in the demonstration garden this year, which is a little bit more disease resistant. Cash machine, we're trying the demonstration garden again, a little more disease resistant. Black beauty has been around a long time. That and dunja were grown in the Virginia vegetable trials last year, and both did well. The cocozelle golden is, like I said, it looks just like a zucchini in the shape. It's a really bright gold, which is sometimes helpful because it's hard to find zucchini. Tramontino is a winter squash, and that variety center cut has been bred by a company called Rose 7, so that you can harvest them when they're 6, maybe 8 inches, and you treat them like a zucchini, and they have a nice flavor. But if you miss them at that size, then they're going to grow long enough to become a winter squash and could be saved for winter storage. Patty pan, the sunburst is the yellow color, that makes sense. And then you have the other colors like a pale green. So that's kind of nice. So for winter squash, we have both the Maxima, the Moscata, and the Peppo. So Peppo is the same as the summer, but there's a couple varieties of the Peppo that have a longer maturity period, and that would be like the acorn, the spaghetti, the delicata, and pumpkin. So they have more like 100 days before they're ready, unlike the 50 or so or 60 of the summer squashes. And they'll keep a little bit longer. The Moscata and the Maxima, they will keep for sometimes as long as 4 or 5 months if held properly, but they need to actually mature on the vine and then they develop a hard skin for summer storage. And they won't do that if you take them off the vine. I've had bug problems and had to harvest them early, and you can still eat them, but I can't save them. I have to eat them. So in that picture there, that lightish green one is a kind of Tramontino. And if it had been trellised, it would have grown straight. And the thing with Tramontino is all the seeds are in that little bottom globe part, just like a butternut squash. All the seeds are in that. We grow that in the demonstration garden, and that does really well there. The one on the bottom is Northern Georgia Candy Roaster. And somebody gifted me a couple plants of that a couple years ago, and they literally grew that big, and they are delicious. Those are probably 4 or 5 pounds a piece. They have this beautiful orange meat inside. I really like them a lot. So I grew them the next year, and then I had a problem with bugs, which was kind of sad. So some of the ones that do well and are resistant to squash borers are butternut squash and Tramontino. Somehow the stems of those 2 varieties are a little bit more difficult for the squash borer larvae to burrow into and then form like the grubs that actually like kill the plant. Acorn and delicata and spaghetti, those are all good bets. They tend not to have as tough a skin. You grow spaghetti squash until it's bright yellow color and it's ready to go. So that's those. And here's a couple pictures. So Tramontino in that picture there, you can see they're kind of different colors. They start out a greener color when they're like the 6 or 8 inches, and then they get a really deep green. And the ones there in that picture, they're starting to turn from that deep green to what will be like a tannish with a little bit of orange color to them as they start to get ready to finish up their ripening. And they can be quite large, and you have all that meat in that neck part of it. So I guess it's kind of taken after a trombone kind of idea. The Northern Georgia Candy Roaster. So I showed you the great looking squash before. Here's where I grew it the second year, and the squash borer got it. All of a sudden, one day the leaves started to droop, and at first I thought it was water, and then I was able to realize that it was not. So I was able to eat that squash. It wasn't quite as ripe as I would have liked. There was no way it was going to actually harden and cure. And then to the right, we have the butternut squash that was growing on the ground instead of on a trellis, and it's doing fine. It looks like the stem is starting to harden off and dry and will be ripe fairly soon. And that takes us to questions.
We do have a couple of questions about fertilizer in the chat. One participant was hoping you could provide some suggestions generally for organic fertilizers for vegetables. And another participant was hoping you could dive in just a little bit more on specific recommendations for fertilizers for tomatoes.
Frankly, I use tomato tone for tomatoes. It's kind of a nice blend. I usually spread it in the bed according to the directions before I start planting and kind of work it in. I plant, and then a few weeks later, maybe even a month, I'll side dress around the plants a little bit again according to the directions. Frankly, I find that's fine because I also use compost and all in my garden. So that's kind of a nice, easy fertilizer to apply. Susan, what do you use?
We use tomato tone on our tomatoes. Other than that, I don't fertilize. I just use the compost. Early in the season, when I'm turning the soil, we put down a blood meal, just some general nitrogen, because nitrogen is the one thing that does not stay in the soil. But other than that, I don't. But there's a fabulous resource that the University of Maryland has on fertilizers. You can find it online, and it takes you through all the different ways of plants, how to fertilize them, and it gives you calculations for determining how much to use and how to convert chemical fertilizers into measurements for organic fertilizers. Anything you want to know about fertilizer is on that sheet, so I highly recommend it.
I've also had good luck with fish emulsion as well for fertilization.
I use diluted fish emulsion when I first plant. I actually use it on some of my green vegetables too, like my leafy greens, but I use a diluted variety. And yeah, it's really messy. You don't want to spill it on yourself. And that's pretty cheap too, I mean, you just put it in your watering can to the recommendations, and it's good when you first plant them.
One more late breaking question here. Rachel was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how we best store the winter squash, if there's any suggestions to check on readiness for the harvest or any tips or tricks for storage.
The first tip is you need to let it stay on the plant so that it gets to the right color and that the stem actually dries out. Once you get past this, like the squash borer stage, generally they don't get attacked very much. Sometimes the squash plants get powdery mildew or something and you have to cut it off, but the plant itself will still continue. So you want to get to that point. When you harvest it, you want to use heavy duty shears so that you can leave the stem on the plant, because if you break the stem off the plant, then you have the opportunity for bacteria to get in at that like sort of open end, although it'll like kind of dry off. I live in a townhouse, so I frankly just keep them in a box in my office, which is kind of at the lowest level of my townhouse. And if you can keep them in a cool place, that would be fine. I've had mine harvest them in October and use them in like February or March. Sometimes they look great and they are great, but what will start to happen over time is they'll start to dry out a little bit on the inside. So they can still be good to use. Like I've made soup where I found I had to actually put it through a strainer. I try to use mine a little bit sooner than March, but still having them for November, December, January is pretty cool. Or you can roast them and take the meat and freeze it too.
Okay, we're going to skip garlic and onions, our two bonus crops, in the interest of time. So let's get right into pests and diseases. And the purpose of this section is basically just to increase your awareness, help you avoid serious problems, and let you know where you can go to get help. While there are a wide variety of insect pests in the garden, that doesn't mean you're going to see any of them. They may be there, they may not, but you need to know how to identify them in case they are, so you can deal with them early before they become a big problem. The 6 bugs on this slide are the 6 most common ones found in the community garden where Dona gardens. There's the Mexican bean beetle, which you see on beans, obviously. Harlequin bugs you might see on collards. The squash bug and the squash vine borer are on squash. Cucumber beetles are primarily on cucumbers, but you can see them on other plants. And whitefly and aphids are more generalist. They can appear in different places. One thing I want to call your particular attention to is the squash vine borer. The two photos on the upper right-hand corner. To the left, you see an actual picture of the insect itself. You need to look for that. The borer that does the damage, the larva inside the squash, is the picture that's inside the stem. And you actually have to look inside the stem to see that. So let's talk about some of your control measures for pests. The first thing we're going to talk about is some planting time methods where you avoid the heavy insect infestations. And these recommendations are coming from the Virginia Cooperative Extension Pest Management Guide for this year. So for example, if you plant your green beans as early as you possibly can so that you can harvest them before July 1st, you'll miss the Mexican bean beetle season. If you want to plant beans, however, through July, when the Mexican bean beetle is the most active, you'll need to use a row cover. And since bush beans don't need to have pollinators, you just keep the row cover on through the end of July, removing it only to harvest, and that should take care of your problem. Squash and cucumbers, if you plant after a certain time, you can avoid both squash bugs and cucumber beetles. Cucumbers you want to plant after June 15th in Northern Virginia, and squash, if you plant in late June or July, you'll avoid the time when the squash bugs are laying their eggs. Another thing to do is to be in your garden early and often, looking for insects and hand picking them or destroying them when you see them. You can hand pick the insects and squeeze them with your hand. You can toss them in a container of soapy water if you prefer to do that. The egg masses you can often destroy just by folding the leaf over and squishing them. If you do that, you want to take the leaf off the plant and put it in your trash, not your compost. You want to remove weeds, especially in the fall, because many pests overwinter in the fall. And physical barriers are another option, and we're going to talk about that more on the next two slides. Physical barriers basically protect the plants from insect pests or even small rabbits and chipmunks. The example on the page here in the lower left is a plastic little closure that has a vent in the top to let air out. It's designed to discourage small rabbits and chipmunks. If you use something like that, you need to be really sensitive to the temperatures because they can get really hot under one of those once the temperatures go up. The other slide is an example of using an insect barrier that has been clipped to a tomato cage around peppers to prevent insects coming in. In both cases, when you're using physical barriers, you got to be conscious of the pollinating needs of the plants you're covering. So if you're using it on a plant that flowers, like squash or cucumbers, like Dona's already mentioned, you'll need to remove the cover once the blossoms appear so that they can be pollinated. Things that pollinate themselves or don't need to be pollinated, like beans, carrots, and chard, you can leave the row cover on and just take it off to harvest and then put them back. On the next slide, we've got a couple of other examples of physical barriers. On the left side, that is a commercial product called Agribon 19. In this case, it's being put over some lettuce. It keeps out bugs, but it lets in sun and rain. The photograph on the right is an earlier photograph of Dona's cucumbers. And this one, she's covered with a tulle netting, which is a fabric you can buy at fabric stores. It's often used to put stiffeners under like wedding dresses and things like that. Anyway, it's fairly inexpensive. She's draped it over the top of her cucumber trellis. At the bottom, you can see that it's weighted down with rocks to keep anything from getting through under the bottom, and the sides have been clipped with bag clips to keep insects from getting in that way. And as Donna explained earlier, she had a mix of cucumbers that needed to be pollinated and some that didn't. So she did have to take this barrier off once the plants started to flower. The other thing I want to call your attention to in this picture on the right is you'll notice on the bottom, I hope you can see them, there's some milk jugs stuck in the ground. The bottoms have been cut out of those milk jugs and they've been put over her baby cucumber plants to protect them from the slugs. Ecological gardening. There's a lot of really good pests in the world that'll take care of your bug problems for you. Things like lady beetles, parasitic wasps, spiders, and syrphid flies will all eat the bad guys. And so you'll need to both attract them to your garden and you're going to want to know what they look like. Fortunately, there's all kinds of things that you can plant in your garden to attract these beneficial insects. Herbs like dill, fennel, and cilantro. Oregano attracts syrphid flies. Alyssum, which is a low-growing white flower annual, attracts parasitic wasps that eat aphids. And cosmos, black-eyed Susans, and annual sunflowers attract lacewings and ladybugs. You can also use cover crops that go to flower to attract beneficial insects. We've given you a few more names here on the right-hand side of this slide. Our next slide gives you 3 more close-up pictures of a couple of beneficial insects. The lady beetle on the far left and the syrphid or hovered fly on the right are great. They just can't eat enough aphids. The lady beetles also will attack mites. In the center, you've got a parasitoid wasp. They're really, really tiny and they're hard to see, but they're fantastic little bugs. They're the ones that attack caterpillars and they lay their eggs in the caterpillars and the larvae eat the caterpillars from the inside out. On tomato worms, sometimes you'll see these little white things on the top of the tomato worm, and that's a sign that the larvae are working on the inside and you don't have to worry about it. The pictures here have been enlarged so you can see what they look like. The big takeaway from here is if you see something in your garden, you need to find out what it is before you take an action against it. And if you don't know, pop one in a little medicine jar, throw a little alcohol in it, take it to the help desk or one of the plant clinics, and they'll help you identify it. Now I'll turn it over to Dona.
So as we want you to know your enemies in form of pests, we also want you to know your enemies in form of diseases. So I've been talking about mildew and I talked a little bit about blight, but not so much. So Downy mildew and powdery blight can be found on the cucurbits. So that would be the squash and the cucumbers. The other 4 are sometimes found on tomatoes. Early blight and late blight are kind of often found here, especially early blight on our tomatoes because of the climate and temperatures. And then sometimes the septoria leaf spot. So I want you to be able to kind of identify them. But let's talk about some things we could do to keep them from happening and then what to do if you end up getting some. So 1, you can select cultivars of plants that are bred for disease resistance and tolerance of conditions. There are lots of plants that are disease resistant in all those varieties, tomatoes, cucumbers, and squash. But, you can stick with the heritage ones because you just like those and sort of do some of these next things. Like you want to plant them with enough space. On one hand, you want to plant things close enough to kind of keep the weeds down and to take advantage of your space. But on the other hand, if you plant things too close, you don't allow enough airflow. And airflow is really important to kind of keep some of the diseases from forming. By this point, you should have put mulch down to keep the diseases in the soil from splashing up on the plant leaves and to help the plant not be stressed. Because if the plant is stressed, then it's kind of weakened and that makes it a little bit more susceptible to some of these diseases. Definitely no overhead watering. Don't stand there and spray the leaves. The leaves don't help the plant. The water needs to be at the roots. If you can water early in the day so that then the leaves dry, that is helpful for not having diseases form, especially like the mildews. You'll also see powdery mildew on zinnias. Same problem. Sometimes they get so crowded because they do so well that then you get sort of that white on the leaves and it doesn't look that attractive. When that starts to form, cut it off. 1, it allows you to help keep it from spreading to the rest of the plant or other plants. And also it helps create some airflow. Sometimes zucchini leaves could be, bigger than your head. And when you cut them off all the way down to the stem. Take the whole stem and the leaf with it. And then the other thing is as you're working and cutting things off, if you work on one plant that is diseased, clean your shears with alcohol before you go to the next plant and also be conscious of like your hands and your gloves in terms of trying not to spread stuff within your own garden. Those are the mechanisms for helping prevent the diseases. Now we have some resources for you. The 2 that we like are the Virginia Cooperative Extension has a pest management guide and it has a whole chapter on both the diseases and insects and even weeds. And that link is there. The University of Maryland Extension Service also has a link that's really good for talking about specific vegetables and insects and diseases that you can find there. What we've talked about for garden pests is sort of that first line of defense thing. We've talked about things you can do like hand picking and things that you could do like row covers where it makes sense. Then you have that last resort, which is when you're going to start to maybe have to use some chemicals. If you're in a organic garden like I am, I can use things like neem oil, but some of these things I may not want to use in my garden. I try not to use chemicals at all because I don't really want to use a chemical that could actually impact some of the beneficial insects. So in some cases, I'd rather work hard at hand picking some of these things. If you get the egg masses, that helps a whole lot. So getting to learn what the egg masses look like, and they're usually underneath the leaves, is a real win. But we don't want you to feel like this is overwhelming because chances are you may not see any of these things, or you may just see 1 or 2 of these things. Don't be scared or worried. And we have lots of resources. One of the most valuable from an online one, besides the two I just mentioned for BCE and Maryland, is that one at the bottom between the rows. That's a monthly vegetable gardening newsletter that Master Gardeners have been working on a long time.
Thank you for all of this wonderful information.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate everybody's attention, and I hope you have fun this year growing at least one or two of these top 10 vegetables.
Thanks, everybody.